One question comes
Yes.
back in the 80s. That's also when there was some changes in tax policy
Yes,
as well.
yes. The question
Did that
was,
have any impact?
what about the tax changes in the 1980s? The tax changes in the 1980s mainly, well, what it did was mainly two things. Eliminated certain loopholes and also eliminated the top tax brackets. So the federal income tax became less progressive, as well, less higher brackets, fewer higher brackets, but at the same time fewer loopholes, fewer deductions. I don't think it really had an impact on this overall. And what I want to talk about next, the next subject is going to be overall federal budget deficits and so on. But let me just get to one thing first. Okay. One thing I haven't covered yet is private borrowing. And this is a very important chart, borrowing, because when we talk about easy Federal Reserve policy or tight Federal Reserve policy, we're talking about borrowing, aren't we? That's what it's all about, borrowing. Borrow more, borrow less, whatever. Okay, let's talk about it. If I produce $1 worth of goods, and I earn $1 worth of goods, and I spend $1 worth of goods, there shouldn't be any inflation. But if I can borrow another $1 and spend it, well, the prices will rise. So, we all understand that the only way prices can rise is if there's going to be borrowing and the spending of those borrowed funds. So, for instance, if we have just as much to spend next year as this year, prices won't rise. But if next year we can spend 10% more than we spent this year, and let's say output didn't grow at all, then prices ought to rise by 10. If we have 20% more to spend and output rises by 5%, well, then maybe prices will go up by 15%. So it really depends on the relationship of how much production, supply increases versus how much demand increases. So the borrowing is very important because the borrowing determines the demand growth, doesn't it? All right, let's take a look at some numbers. Let's go all the way back to 1970. Looking at the chart, you tell me, to the nearest $100 billion, how much, what was borrowing, looking at the nearest $100 billion in 1970? About 100. How about 1974, 5?
200.
How about 1979, 80?
300.
400. Call it 400 because that makes my example better. Okay, so does you see what's happening? Every 5 years it doubles. Everybody get it? Now, I want you to do a mathematical extrapolation for me. You know what they say? As long as there's math tests, there'll be prayer in the schools. Okay, now, trust me, I know. Okay, now, at that rate, 100, 200, 400 in 1970, 75, 80, how large would borrowing be by the year 2008? Does everybody see the extrapolation? Well, I'm asking for. So, if the borrowing is 100 in 1970, well, let's call it 1970. Makes it easy. If the borrowing is 100 in 1970, 200 in 1975, 400 in 1980, see, doubling every 5 years. what would the borrowing be by 2005? Forget 2008. Let's just say 2005. And so then you can go up, right? 1980, 85, 90, 95, 2000, 2005. So who can do the math?
12.8.
1.28 trillion.
12.8?
128.
12.8 trillion. Is that correct? All right, listen. That's what you said. Listen. Now, where's 12.8 trillion on this chart? Well, if this is the first floor, 12.8 would be somewhere on the second floor, right? Because this thing only goes up to 2.8. So you can understand why the Federal Reserve finally stopped the borrowing from growing like it. Does everybody understand the borrowing was rising rapidly? Now you can't tell. You can't tell because this chart has an arithmetic and not a logarithmic scale. But the curve was going like that. Because by 2005, it would have been up there at 12.8. Everybody see that? And what would inflation have been like? Inflation would have been horrible, right? Horrible. But the Federal Reserve didn't let it happen. Now, have we had a big surge in borrowing lately? Oh yeah. Since 1990, it looks like borrowing is growing a lot, has grown a lot, doesn't it? It looks like it's grown a lot. What's different about the economy today on the supply side that might have held inflation down? Lately.
China. Cost of imported goods are less.
Right. Now today, competition is global. In the 1970s, it was easy to run out of capacity. We remember how we saw the chart, capacity utilization. Capacity utilization was often pushed very high. Nowadays, two things are going on. One, industry has added capacity so rapidly here in this country that it's hard to get to high capacity utilization, and therefore it's hard to get to the situation. It's hard to get to high capacity utilization, and it's hard to get to the situation where productivity begins to fall, and we have a lot of international competition. A lot of international competition tends to keep inflation down. So when we go back to the private borrowing, even though it's surged lately, not much inflation. But the private borrowing is still a pretty good measure of expansion. The business borrowing a lot in the late 90s. Households borrowing a lot. Mortgage borrowing high for residential construction. So here's what I want you to do now. What I want you to do now is go to the web and take a look at the following data. Everything from private borrowing through long-term interest rates. Only that's not very much, is it? Private borrowing, short-term rates, long-term rates. And let's find out where is borrowing today and where are interest rates today. And we won't have to take a long time to do that.